I live in a camper after losing my job. Parents refused to help me. I got a better job and bought a house. Now they want my house for my golden brother. Hello. Reddit eyes plus here. Growing up, my younger brother Dan was the favorite. He was 3 years younger than me, but he developed a superiority complex early on. Our parents always favored him, and I got the short end of the stick. While he got away with everything, I was punished for any retaliation. Dan even flirted with my first girlfriend until she dumped me. My parents' solution? Suck it up. Life had been rough, especially since the start of the 2020 pandemic. I lost my job, my condo, and had to sell most of my belongings. With nowhere to go, I ended up living in a camper on my truck, moving from place to place, dealing with everything from beggars to people calling my camper an eyesore. I eventually landed a job that allowed me to park my camper in the back lot, and the boss let me plug into the building for power and water. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. Midway through the year, I got promoted to a supervisor role with a better salary. I saved up and bought a 3-bedroom manufactured home close to work. It felt like a fresh start, a new chapter in my life. I was proud of my achievement and even posted about it on social media. That's when the trouble began. A few weeks later, my parents, Dan, and his family showed up unannounced. They'd found out where I lived somehow and barged in like they owned the place. Dan asked to speak privately, and that's when the bomb dropped. He wanted to move his family into my house because it was closer to his job and they needed more space with a 4th kid on the way. He suggested I live in the camper in my own backyard. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. No rent offer, no consideration for my needs. Just entitlement. I started recording the conversation on my phone as Dan rambled about why he needed my house. When I finally told him hell no, he got in my face, accusing me of not deserving the house because I didn't have a family. Our parents and his wife joined in, trying to pressure me into agreeing. It was chaos. Esil screamed at me, claiming I couldn't do this to her because she was pregnant. She even attacked me, landing a hit on my face. That's when I threatened to call the cops. They finally left, but not without my mother telling me I had a week to come to my senses. I stood my ground. My house wasn't up for grabs. They had no say in my life, and their entitlement wouldn't dictate my future. The recording on my phone was my backup, my proof if things escalated. This was my home, my sanctuary, and I wasn't going to let them take it from me. After I kicked my parents, brother, and sister-in-law out for trying to force me to hand over my new house to my brother, I immediately went to my social media and told the story to the whole family. It spread quickly, but you won't find it now because it all got deleted some time ago, and I put my profile on private. I posted about it because I knew that the first thing my family would do when they got home was try to twist the event to make me the villain. And I was exactly right. But I had about an hour to get started before them. I also had video evidence to back up my story about what they'd done. No, I don't plan on showing the video here. So don't ask. Being preemptive worked because I got a fair number of family members on my side right away. My parents, Dan and Esil, must have been all set to write their own post, but it was too late, so they didn't even bother trying to lie much. My parents, Dan and Esil, had a few flying monkeys supporting them, but not much else. Plenty of others knew how entitled they already were. So what happened was something they all quickly understood and accepted. There was one person in particular that called me. I don't know who they were, but they ranted at me that I was a horrible brother and that I needed to make way for a real family man. I just ended the call and blocked the number. This didn't repeat. The week went by, and my parents showed up with Dan at my front porch, just like they said they would in their prior ultimatum. They rang my doorbell like crazy and also pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack, and they tried to shove their way in again, but I'd installed a couple of latch chains that prevented it, and even braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording everything on camera and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother calmed them down, and then, in her most sickly sweet tone, asked me if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her, and the rest of them, to fuck off and never come back. My mother put on the crocodile tears and asked me why I can't just do this for Dan, because he's my beloved brother. I laughed, and then bluntly said, I do not love him as a brother, because he treated me like shit for years, and they only encouraged him to do so. They are terrible parents, and he is a terrible brother. I then told them to leave or I'd be calling the police ASAP. They all left surprisingly easily, apart from my mother's loud crying and the others giving me dirty looks. One could say making them leave was suspiciously easy. I thought the whole mess was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously because they had other stupid plans. I came home later that week on Friday evening to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family moving stuff in. He just waved to me with a shit-eating grin when I saw him. I was furious and told him and the rest of his family to stop. But Sil smugly said to me that, like it or not, they were moving in. And then, in the most fake way, while tilting her head and puckering her lips, she said that it was okay because my mommy allowed it, and I should always listen to what my mommy tells me. I seethed with rage, just hearing those words and looking at her smug, bitchy face. So I locked myself in my truck to call the cops right away. When they realized what I was doing, SIL started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop, and that I can't do this to her because she and Dan need the house. She cried, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I responded, "Dan, it's my damn house, not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police, all of which the 911 operator heard, thanks to the window being slightly open. I told SIL if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her, and she was smart enough to retreat. When the police arrived, Dan and Sil, along with their kids, had locked themselves in my house. I told the cops what had happened and showed them my new driver's license that had my current address on it. Then, when we went to my front door, I saw that they'd changed the lock. The old lock was laying on the porch with the center of it drilled out, and the drill they used was laying right next to it, with a complete Harbor Freight drill bit set. Could they have been any more stupid, leaving evidence out like that? I pointed out the broken lock and drill, then gave the police a rundown on all the events that happened prior. Well, I guess Dan called our parents over at some point after I arrived home because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately lied and started saying that I'd agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was an easily provable lie one way or another. So Dan and SIL finally came out of my house with some papers in hand. They both looked super smug, like they'd somehow outsmarted me. They'd actually drawn up and printed out a fake rental agreement, but my signature was not on it. There was one, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I don't think any of them have ever actually seen my signature, so that was incredibly stupid on their part. I told my parents and Dan that it was stupidly blatant fraud, and if the cops investigated, they'd easily figure that out. And I don't think going to jail and court would do them any good. It could even make Dan lose his job, which is his only means of providing for his family. I also said I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken. And I'd call CPS too for good measure. Dan went white and looked really scared when I said all that, but my mother got between us and doubled down about how I should just do this for Dan and live in the damn camper so they can finally have a family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could do it for Dan herself and let Dan have her house to himself instead. The cops separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted them all out right now, or I'd press charges. I stated in a shout about how they drilled out my front door lock to break in. The lease papers were obvious fakes, they badly forged my signature, and I have recorded video of SIL attacking me. Those are felonies I could fuck over their lives with if I wanted. And if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I'd do. The only reason I hadn't already was for the sake of Dan's kids, so they have one chance to get the fuck out. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked that they could not force me to do it for Dan. My mother surrendered and said she'd put an end to this. Then she went over to Sil and spoke with her quietly for a minute, while my father spoke to Dan. Sil instantly started loudly crying and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits and tossing them like confetti, only to have an officer tell them to pick up the bits of paper or he'd cite them for littering. Both of the cops at this point had the "I don't get paid enough for this" look on their faces. Dan had to start telling his kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the eldest was sobbing that he won't get his own room now. SIL and Dan gathered their kids up to try and make one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with the sad family routine. You know, where they all gather together in a sort of group hug while all facing one direction. I swear, I think they'd practiced it beforehand. All of the kids had the same pleading look with quivering mouths. SIL kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy, and my brother just made the saddest face he possibly could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here." But I didn't falter and told them to keep packing. All the kids in SIL turned the crying up to 11, and Dan yelled at me, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out family." I ended up laughing like a maniac and retorting that what he was trying to do was taking, not sharing, and no amount of crying will make me let his family move in because he's no brother of mine anymore. He's just an entitled prick who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me, like when we were kids. Dan started F-bombing me until the cops told him to cool it, or he'd be in cuffs, regardless if I wanted to press charges. He sucked in his lips and looked a mix of afraid and supremely pissed off. I asked the cops if they could stick around until my parents, brother, and SIL had all left. They said they had no intention of going anywhere until this had been resolved. In fact, in the next few minutes, 2 cops became 4 as more drove in for whatever reason. That gave my parents some extra incentive to get moving. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he'd put on my front door, though I got another lock the next day anyway because I didn't know if he had copies of the keys or not. He was really reluctant to hand them over. Then, instead of handing them to me, he actually threw them down the street. I had to go and find them with one of the officers while giving Dan a death glare. When I had the keys, my parents, Dan and Sil, had finally finished packing their kids and stuff back into the truck and left. Sil was the angriest of them all because she was heavily pregnant and didn't want to go back to living in my parents' cramped house, but there was no other way. After they left, the police told me they'd make a report, but I was told that I should go to a courthouse to get a restraining order as soon as possible. I thanked them and then got to work putting my new lock on the front door. Then I went to Reddit to tell everyone what happened. I also called a lawyer as soon as I had time. He told me that since they didn't actually manage to move in, and I have no need to formally evict them, I can get a restraining order pretty easily.